If you were an American sending a message at any time before 1844, chances are you sent that message using a horseback rider. With today's tweets and posts crossing the globe instantly, it is hard to imagine the incredibly slow pace at which information traveled in the mid-19th century. On May 24, 1844, that all changed with a simple message: "What hath God wrought?" For the first time in history, instant communications became possible. The history behind the invention and adoption of the electromagnetic telegraph is the story of instant messaging, America's first online service. Samuel F.B. Morse, the sender of that message, was not the first to come up with the idea of a telegraph. In fact, the word telegraph just means a message being sent to a distant location. In the late 1700s in Europe, innovators such as the Schacht brothers experimented and improved on telegraphs that transmitted messages by signal. Their invention was called the optical telegraph because it was limited by what the eye could see. Messages sent by optical telegraph required relay towers to transmit and receive the signals from one tower to another. The process was used during the French Revolution to provide updates to Paris, but it had a number of limitations. Because the messages had to actually be seen by the next tower, hills and forests, or fog, limited the effectiveness of this innovation. The optical telegraph was also limited by how long it took to be sent from tower to tower, which could take hours depending on how far the message needed to be sent. In the United States prior to 1844, messages were almost exclusively delivered by ship or horseback carrier. Ships could carry messages along certain routes, but could not be sent where there were no deep waterways. More often, a message would be delivered by a horseback carrier who would ride from one post to another. On average, a healthy horse could travel 35 miles per day, so messages could take days or weeks to reach their intended target. Morse's work on the telegraph was inspired by these limitations. Originally a painter, Morse was in Washington, D.C. in February 1825, painting a picture of the Marquis de Lafayette. On February 9th, he sent a letter back home to his wife in Connecticut, telling her that John Quincy Adams had been elected as president. Morse did not know when he sent that message his wife had already been dead for 2 days. By the time he received the letter that she was sick and made it back home, she had already been buried. Frustrated and saddened by the situation, he devoted himself to perfecting the telegraph to allow for instant messages over great distances. By the time Morse started his work, Europeans already had a head start on figuring out how to use electricity to send messages instantly. In 1744, a French scientist conducted an experiment to see how fast electricity traveled. He asked monks to stand side by side in a line over a mile long and had them hold one long continuous wire. Without telling them what he was doing, he sent an electric current through the wire. The instant wincing and groans let out by the entire line showed that electricity traveled long distances almost instantly. Sending electricity was not the same as sending messages, though. Electromagnetism, not electricity, is what made Morse's telegraph work. With the help of other scientists, Morse was the first to use electromagnetism to instantly deliver messages. Morse was able to signal dots and dashes, which corresponded to letters of the alphabet, a system known as Morse code. That system allowed detailed messages and not just electricity to be sent over great distances. Morse needed money to build poles and wires to create a network for his system. After several unsuccessful attempts to convince Congress to pay for his wires, Morse finally received preliminary funding in 1843. With this money, he set up a telegraph station in the Supreme Court of the United States and another at the Baltimore Railroad Station. On May 24, 1844, surrounded by doubting legislators, he delivered the four-word message and made believers out of Congress. At the beginning, most investment in the telegraph system resulted in the construction of telegraph lines along the East Coast. Western Union had 44,000 miles of lines in 1856, but almost all of it was east of the Mississippi River. As the frontier raced further and further west, lines in the east did little to prevent it from being more and more cut off from the events of Washington and New York. Prior to 1860, it still took at least 3 weeks for a message to reach San Francisco from the East Coast by horseback rider. In fact, when President William Henry Harrison died in 1841, Los Angeles did not learn of his death until 110 days later. While telegraph lines were going up across the eastern United States, messages to the west coast were still being sent by the horseback carriers. The new, uncharted areas of the frontier proved to be difficult to cross. Harsh terrain, swollen rivers, and attacks from Native Americans who lived on the plains delayed and even prevented messages from crossing the frontier. In 1860, the Pony Express was created to shorten the time it took for messages to reach the West Coast and avoid some of these pitfalls. Using a relay team of riders and horses, the Pony Express was able to shorten the delivery time from East to West Coast to 10 days. That relay system would last only 18 months, replaced by the transcontinental telegraph. Congress, seeing the impact of the telegraph on business and the military, authorized the U.S. Treasury to fund the construction of a telegraph system across the frontier. 2 days after that line's completion, the Pony Express stopped running. The telegraph changed the way news traveled. The Associated Press, known as The Wire, sent news stories instantly by telegraph to places that previously waited so long for news that it was no longer news when it arrived. It forever changed the way business was done. Wiring money, a practice still in use today, got its name because money was sent using telegrams. Markets across the country became more efficient since they could have real-time price information across large areas. The readouts from those telegraphs in stock markets were called tickers, a term still used today for the stock market. The telegraph also changed the way war was conducted, most especially during the Civil War. It is said that George Washington waged war in the same way that Henry VIII, Charlemagne, Julius Caesar, and generals for thousands of years before him had, by relying on outdated battlefield information delivered by horseback rider. Thanks to the telegraph, Edwin Stanton, Secretary of War for the Union during the Civil War, was able to receive instant reports from battlefields hundreds of miles away and adjust strategy based on these reports. President Lincoln routinely spent hours in a room next to the War Department, reading and sending telegrams about the war. Supply lines were attacked at rail lines, but the supply of information was attacked at the telegraph. While the telegraph opened up the western frontier of the United States, it crossed international frontiers too. Using underwater cables, President Buchanan and Queen Victoria exchanged telegraph messages as early as 1858. International communications were forever changed with the transatlantic telegraph. Eventually, the telegraph would be replaced by newer technologies, such as the telephone, radio, and television. The roots of such innovations could be directly traced back to the telegraph. Alexander Graham Bell's invention of the telephone came as he tried to improve Morse's telegraph. Marconi was trying to create a wireless telegraph when he invented what would become known as the radio. Thomas Edison, who invented the motion picture camera, worked as a telegraph operator for Western Union in the 1860s. Even after the invention of the telephone in 1876, the telegraph continued to be used extensively. In 1929 alone, Western Union sent over 200 million telegrams across the United States. Radio didn't fully replace the telegraph either. Ronald Reagan was a sports announcer in the 1930s for a radio station in Des Moines, Iowa. He was a play-by-play broadcaster for the Chicago Cubs, but broadcasted from a studio in Iowa. He received the information for each play by a telegraph, and then relayed the action to his radio listeners. During one game, the telegraph line went dead, and Reagan completely made up a 12-minute at-bat to avoid anyone knowing what had happened. At a time when the country was growing further and further apart, the telegraph brought people closer together. Whether it was between families divided by the vast frontier of the plains, or loved ones divided by military assignment during World War II, it was the telegraph that made meaningful and instant connection. Morse, sitting 150 years earlier, could see the value of instant messaging to make those connections. When reflecting on his invention, Morse hoped that, quote, it might bring a husband to the bedside of a dying wife or save the life of a beloved child, end quote. Even with all the benefits of the telegraph came questions that we still face today. How fast is too fast when it comes to information? Should the government use taxpayer money to help get new technologies off the ground? Should the government regulate new technology to make sure it is used for the most good? When monopolies like Western Union happen, what should the government do about it? The answers America gave as it crossed these frontiers are both space and technology, and the lessons learned from the result of those answers help inform today's decision makers as they struggle with similar questions on space-age technologies. The history of the telegraph shows us that no matter the barrier to be overcome, no frontier is too wide that it cannot be crossed using innovation. It is a message that is still being delivered to distant audiences decades after Morse and his telegraph signed off.